This is the Global News Podcast from the BBC World Service. I'm Jackie Leonard, and in the early hours of Wednesday, the 23rd of February, these are our main stories. President Biden says he's imposing sanctions against Russia that go far beyond those put in place after it annexed Crimea in response to Moscow's actions in eastern Ukraine. The European Union and Britain have also announced sanctions. Russia's parliament, meanwhile, has authorized President Putin to use the Russian military abroad. Also in this podcast.
We definitely noticed an uptick in used vehicle pricing. Some used car prices are more expensive than new car prices of the same model.
The impact of rising car prices in the US. President Biden has announced US sanctions on Russia, which he said went far beyond those imposed after the annexation of Crimea. He said President Putin was establishing a rationale to take more Ukrainian territory and condemned his decision to recognize the independence of areas in eastern Ukraine controlled by Russian-backed separatists. Mr. Biden also said he would continue to provide Ukraine with what he called defensive assistance and would move additional US forces to the Baltic states, which are NATO members.
This is the beginning of a Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm going to begin to impose sanctions in response far beyond the steps we and our allies and partners implemented in 2014. And if Russia goes further with this invasion, we stand prepared to go further as with sanctions. Who in the Lord's name does Putin think gives him the right to declare new so-called countries on territory that belong to his neighbors? This is a flagrant violation of international law, and it demands a firm response from the international community.
The sanctions have been coordinated with allies, including Britain and the European Union. We'll hear from Paris and Moscow in a moment. But first, our State Department correspondent Barbara Plett-Usher told us the message from Washington has changed over the last 24 hours.
So yesterday, when the announcement was made about Russia recognizing the rebel regions in eastern Ukraine, U.S. officials were saying, we have sanctioned people trading with those two so-called republics, but this is not our swift and severe response. They were saying that the decision was a flagrant violation of Russia's international commitments, but they didn't go further than that. Today, we are getting much stronger language. The Americans are saying this is an invasion, the beginning of an invasion, as President Biden stated there. And some officials are saying, yes, you can say this is the beginning of the swift and severe response. But I mean, this is all sort of semantics or information warfare in a way. I think what we have to look at what has actually been announced. So the sanctions are harsh. The sanctions on two major financial institutions, blocking them, which means they're not able to, their assets will be frozen and they're not able to deal with U.S. institutions, and also putting sanctions on sovereign debt, which means that the Russian government cannot raise money in the West, which is no small thing. And then some of the elites and their families, the so-called oligarchs, will also be sanctioned. But the way that they're presenting it, as is the case in Europe and in Britain, is that this is going to be a rolling process. So this is the first tranche of sanctions. There were measures that we had been told about by security officials and administration officials that they are contemplating, which Mr. Biden did not announce. So he's holding those back and saying that if Mr. Putin invades Ukraine further, more sanctions will be forthcoming. So that he's trying to send a message today that is severe, but also to hold back enough to be a threat, to try and keep a certain amount of deterrence. Although, given what we've heard from Mr. Putin, it does seem as if he has calculated in the effects of sanctions and he's resolved to act on his worldview and beliefs.
That was Barbara Plett-Usher. And Barbara mentioned there the similar approach of Britain and the European Union. Speaking in Paris, the EU Foreign Policy Chief, Josep Borrell, said Western powers were resolute.
The grave violations Russia is committing will not go unanswered. They are not going unanswered. We are strongly united in this front, and we will raise the level of sanctions substantially according with the Russian behavior, because many question marks are pending on these critical moments.
For more on the strategy of the EU, here's our Europe editor, Katya Adler in Paris.
I think, first of all, what's interesting about the packet of sanctions from the European Union is, how often do we speak about squabbling members of the European Union, particularly when it comes to foreign policy, where decisions have to be unanimous. Again and again, the EU fails to come to concrete decisions. And so it was very proud today. I think amongst all of the Western allies, there's this sense that Vladimir Putin likes to divide and rule amongst his opponents. And so there was this concerted effort to sound united and resolute on these sanctions. So what the EU is proposing, and it will be formalised, it's expected tomorrow, is targeting all individuals who supported the recognition of those two breakaway regions in eastern Ukraine. On top of that, targeting banks, individuals, businesses who were supporting the Russian military or other activities in those regions, and also limiting the Russian state from accessing the EU's financial and capital markets. It's kind of tougher sanctions than were expected, and swifter probably from the European Union as well. And in addition to that comes a really big blow for Russia, and that is Germany announcing that it's going to hold up the paperwork in order to start using a gas pipeline that had been built to directly bring cheaper gas from Russia directly to Germany. But again, sanctions are going to bite Europe as well, and Russia has threatened counter-sanctions. Europe is so reliant on Russian gas. When you look at countries like Germany or Italy or Hungary, massively reliant. Losing that pipeline for Germany is a very big blow. It's getting rid of its nuclear reactors. And we've had warnings from the Association of German Industries saying that that gas prices and energy prices could deal a body blow to German businesses. So there's jumpiness, not about these sanctions. They say they're united on these sanctions, but any further sanctions that the EU has threatened should Russia take any further military action in Ukraine.
And given that dependence that you talk about on Russian fuel, although they are, as you say, giving the impression of unanimity at the moment, there must be tensions.
Oh, my gosh, there are absolutely tensions. I mean, today, there were whispers that Moscow-friendly Hungary or the Hungarian government were dragging their heels on these sanctions, as they did at the time, 8 years ago, at the time of the annexation of Crimea. Now, Budapest denied that, and definitely we heard from the EU's foreign policy chief that all the 27 EU member states were united behind these sanctions. But looking ahead to that threat of possible further sanctions, definitely, as I said, Germany, Italy, Austria, for example, they're worrying about energy access from Russia, but also close business ties as well. And that in turn annoys the more hawkish members of the European Union, say Poland or the Czech Republic, who are irritated about that. You have France defending Emmanuel Macron's pursuit of diplomacy, such a public pursuit of diplomacy, and accusations by some that he was played by Vladimir Putin. But the EU says it's still open to diplomacy, while wholeheartedly supporting the Ukrainian people and behind these sanctions and possibly further sanctions.
Katya Adler. Well, the Russian Foreign Ministry has said the new Western sanctions are illegitimate. The Kremlin says its main goal is to protect people in the separatist regions of Luhansk and Donetsk, who it says are being threatened by Ukraine. But the NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg believes a Russian attack on Ukraine appears very likely.
Every indication is that Russia continues to plan for a full-scale attack on Ukraine. We see the ongoing military build-up. They promised to step back, but they had continued to step up. We see that more and more of the forces are moving out of the camps and are in combat formations and ready to strike. And we see the ongoing provocations in Donbass and the different false flag operations where they try to create a pretext for an attack.
For his part, President Putin says his forces haven't crossed into the two breakaway areas, but they could do so depending on the situation. Meanwhile, Russia's upper house of parliament has approved the president's request to deploy troops. This report from our Moscow correspondent, Steve Rosenberg.
Russia is facing international condemnation, but in Moscow, they're ignoring that. Russian senators voted unanimously to rubber stamp a Kremlin request to send Russian troops into the rebel republics of eastern Ukraine. They stood to the national anthem. it is a major escalation of the crisis.
Это известная степень демилитаризации.
Later, Vladimir Putin delivered what sounded like an ultimatum. Ukraine should demilitarize, he said. A Ukraine armed to the teeth was unacceptable. And he said Ukraine should renounce its ambitions to join NATO. Western leaders are imposing a new round of sanctions on Moscow, and Russia is furious. I talked to Maria Zakharova, spokeswoman for the Russian Foreign Ministry. These sanctions are illegal, she says.
But does Russia not care that its international reputation is getting lower and lower, and your country is seen increasingly as an aggressor?
It's you're inventing this reputation for us. But it's the West's reputation that's covered in blood. The Russian authorities brush away criticism. They claim not to care about sanctions. But this country is growing increasingly isolated. And for now, Moscow appears willing to accept the consequences.
That was Steve Rosenberg in Moscow. There's no clear evidence of Russian troops crossing the border into the rebel-held areas of eastern Ukraine run by Moscow-backed separatists. The BBC's Oleg Karpiak is in the city of Konstantinivka in the Donbass region, about 30 kilometres away from Russian separatist-controlled territories. He's been speaking to James Reynolds.
We are now on the Ukrainian-controlled territory. We can't go to the rebel-held territories, as it's quite difficult even to get accreditation. In fact, it's sealed, and it's very difficult even for local residents to cross the lines. That's why we have not so many news from there, verified news, I mean. From what we know from other reports, that some people are leaving this territory now because they are afraid of possible escalation there. And many of them flee to Russia, some go to Ukraine. And today we met a family with a small child from Donetsk, and they looked happy because they escaped this area. And they told us they didn't see any escalation in Donetsk, but they decided to leave just in case it begins.
And of course, that clarification you gave was extremely important. We should say you and that city is about 30 kilometres away from those Russian separatist-controlled front lines, that so-called line of contact. And is there any sense where you are that Russian forces might be coming to expand beyond that line of control?
Not really. Yesterday we were on the front line talking to some Ukrainian soldiers, and they really don't look anxious. They doing their regular jobs, and they look like any other soldiers you can imagine in any part of the world. They are young, they're making jokes and so on. And when you talk to civilian people, you also get this impression that nothing's going to happen. I don't know why it is so. It's really strange. It really surprises me, but people are really calm here. Of course, they are stressed, they're anxious, but they're not panicking, and they are really calm.
So if you're to paint a picture of what life is like in where you are, Konstantinivka, in Ukrainian-controlled territory, sovereign territory, about 30 kilometres away from the front lines, are shops open? Are cafes and restaurants open? What's going on?
Well, as I mentioned, no panic. People are willing to talk about the situation. People talk to journalists. They talk among themselves. Shops are open. Restaurants are working. Everything's fine. We even saw, we saw a wedding party today in a restaurant in the city. We are staying here. And I can imagine it's because they wanted to marry on 22nd of February 2022. So they must have booked this date before.
I see. And they didn't cancel.
Yeah, they didn't cancel it, and they were really happy people. It was great to see them, and they were talking to us. So things go as usual. There are many cars on streets, no military police, no armored vehicles, no army patrols. Life goes on.
Oleg Karpiak in the Donbass region. Still to come.
It's always had a place in my heart and soul, and it seems to be in the heart and soul of people not just in Britain but all over the world as well.
Gary Brooker, the man best known for the song A Whiter Shade of Pale, has died aged 76. A court in Japan for the first time has ruled that people who were sterilised as part of a programme that targeted those with disabilities should be compensated by the government. The decision is a significant victory for thousands of people who were forced to have operations over several decades. Will Leonardo reports.
Until the mid-1990s, people with disabilities in Japan could be sterilised without their approval. A piece of legislation called the Eugenics Protection Law targeted those deemed by the authorities to be impaired. As well as physical and cognitive disabilities, having behavioural or mental health problems could also make you eligible. All that was needed was for a medical worker to sign off on the procedure. No consent was required from the patient or their families. In one case, a woman was made to have an operation as she was suffering from what was described as hereditary feeble-mindedness. In today's landmark decision, the High Court in Osaka sided with 3 plaintiffs, including a hearing-impaired couple where the woman was forcibly sterilised almost 50 years ago. It ordered the government pay them a combined $250,000 and recognised the eugenics law as unconstitutional. It set a precedent for similar cases in Japan where lower courts have been denying compensation because the sterilisations happened so long ago. The Japanese government has already issued a formal apology for the law, which is estimated to have affected 16,000 victims. In 2019, it offered them $28,000 each in compensation, but the number of people taking them up on this has been low. Activists have criticised the uniform nature of the payout. Others say it's not enough to overcome the stigma of coming forward. After today's ruling in Osaka, one victim awaiting a verdict in his case told Japanese media, "Our lives were completely destroyed. This isn't about money."
That was Will Leonardo. Inflation is a global problem at the moment. The price of used cars and trucks has surged in the US since last year, and it's dashing the hopes of teenagers dreaming of their first car, as Michelle Fleury reports from New Jersey.
Heidi Bavero spends most of her day behind the wheel of her blue Honda minivan. This is her 3rd trip to her local high school in New Jersey as she juggles the busy schedules of her 5 children.
Like tonight, we have to bring them to my son possibly to a game and drop him off and pick him up, drop him off and pick him up.
So they have lots of extracurricular activities?
Yes.
There's no rest from shuttling her kids from work to track meet events, even on the weekends.
So like Saturday, they have another meet, but we have to get up really early and drop them off and then, again, be around to get them because we don't have a car to leave there for her to drive back.
For her 18-year-old daughter, Caroline, not having a car means sitting around in the cold after practice, waiting for her mum to pick her up.
There's not a lot of runners there right now because my daughter had to wait for a ride.
How long were you just waiting for us to come?
Probably around 45 minutes.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so practice ends at like 4:30, but today it ended a little bit earlier, so I just kind of sat on the bench, did my homework.
Caroline and her family aren't alone in the struggle to find a car these days. Car dealerships across the US have much less inventory than they did before the pandemic. Supply chain disruptions, especially when it comes to computer chips essential in today's cars, are leading to shortages of new and used vehicles, sparking huge price increases. For most American families like the Baveros, cars and trucks are a crucial element of life. Cars are also the second most expensive items families buy after their homes. Right. I'm just logging onto Municipid's website. It is an online marketplace for used government goods. And there are plenty of pre-owned vehicles on here. In fact, one of the first things I'm seeing on here is a 2017 Ford Explorer Intercept for sale in Pittsburgh. 12 minutes left currently on this auction, and the highest bid right now is over $10,000. And that is the challenge, the cost. Second-hand car prices have risen at more than double the rate for new cars.
It's been kind of the perfect storm for used vehicle prices.
Greg Benny is Municipid's CEO.
We definitely noticed an uptick in used vehicle pricing, probably to the tune of about 20 to 30%.
20 to 30% increase in price. That's a lot.
Yeah, it's pretty astounding. And some used car prices are more expensive than new car prices of the same model.
Skyrocketing used car prices are at the heart of recent inflationary pressures, but they aren't the only car ownership costs giving the Baveros pause. Here's Heidi's husband, Mark.
Everything seems to have that cumulative effect, and especially with the expenses of cars in general, like I said, the gas, inflation, insurance, the car itself. It just it has a cumulative effect. And then if you're getting more than one car from more than one driver, you can really feel the pressure of those expenses.
All of this means Caroline will have to rely on her mum for rides for a while longer.
Hey, hi, puppy. Michelle Fleury in New Jersey. And let's stay in the US. The women's soccer team has reached a landmark settlement with the Sports American governing body over equal pay. Our sports reporter Jo Curry has the details.
It's taken 6 years, but this long-running dispute, which has been ongoing since 2016, has finally found a resolution. The US women's players will receive $24 million, and US Soccer has pledged equal pay for men's and women's teams across all competitions, including World Cups, going forwards. Now, there have been many parts to this story over the years. Back in 2016, 5 senior members of the team, including the likes of Alex Morgan and Megan Rapinoe, initially filed a complaint against the National Federation for Wage Discrimination. Then, all 28 squad members filed a discrimination lawsuit in 2019 relating to equal pay and working conditions. After today's announcement, Morgan called the news a monumental step forwards, whilst Rapinoe said, "I think we're going to look back on this day and say this is the moment that US Soccer changed for the better." Now, the United States has won the Women's World Cup 4 times and have claimed 5 Olympic gold medals. They said all along all they ever wanted was to be treated and paid fairly, and it appears they've now finally reached that point.
That was Jo Curry. Now to the men's game. European football's governing body UEFA is facing growing pressure to move the Champions League final at the end of May away from the Russian city of St. Petersburg, which also just happens to be the birthplace of Vladimir Putin. UEFA says it's closely monitoring the situation. The Champions League is one of the most prestigious club competitions in the world. Claire McDonnell heard more from Simon Stone.
The game will be played on the 28th of May, but clearly UEFA have a major problem now because as governments across Europe apply sanctions to Russia, and clearly the messaging from Vladimir Putin in particular don't suggest that that is going to de-escalate anytime soon. UEFA have got to look at this situation very, very seriously because they really cannot go against what governments and the majority of governments are doing and the defence of one of their member associations in the Ukraine, hosts of the Euros in 2012, and obviously matches that were played in Donetsk at that time as well. So at the moment, they are looking around, they are speaking to various football associations, trying to establish which countries have the capability to step in and host this game on the 28th of May if it is required, and if, as seems certain, there is no de-escalation, if the sanctions continue to mount against Russia, then really UEFA will have no alternative other than to move this game, which would be the 3rd year in a row that they have had to move the Champions League final at short notice after COVID issues in the last 2 years that have taken it to Portugal.
And Simon, some potential issues as well surrounding the upcoming World Cup playoff matches.
Initially, there is a UEFA youth game, which is an under-19s game involving Dynamo Kiev against Sporting Lisbon that has been delayed by a week. It's been postponed from next Wednesday to March the 9th to allow a chance to see what is happening in Kiev, to see whether the fixture can be rearranged. So that is the first element. But clearly there are some crucial World Cup qualifiers, Ukraine and Russia, both involved in them playoff matches. Russia are at home in those. They do play Poland on the 24th of March and then would play either Sweden or the Czech Republic on the 29th of March, with Ukraine away against Scotland on the 24th of March, and then either Wales or Austria on the 29th of March. Well, it will be interesting to see what happens with those games.
That was Simon Stone. Gary Brooker, the lead singer of Procol Harum, best known for their 1967 hit A Whiter Shade of Pale, has died. He was 76 and had been suffering from cancer. Procol Harum split in the 1970s but reformed in 1991. Our arts correspondent David Silito looks back at Gary Brooker's life.
We skip the light fandango.
May 1967, and the hit song of what would become known as the Summer of Love was from a newly formed group called Procol Harum. Fronting the band was singer Gary Brooker. 50 years later, he was still singing A Whiter Shade of Pale.
I won't say I've dedicated my life to White Shade of Pale, but it's always been a part of it, and I've sung it and played it, not just with Procol Harum, but with many, many other big star bands and different artists. And it's always had a place in my heart and soul. And it seems to be in the heart and soul of people, not just in Britain, but all over the world as well.
Born in London, he'd started performing in the early 60s, but everything took off when he formed Procol Harum. 60 years after his career began, he could look back on thousands of performances, more than a dozen albums, and one of the defining songs of the 60s.
Turn the whiter shade of pale.
David Sillito reporting. And that's all from us for now, but there will be a new edition of the Global News podcast later. If you would like to comment on this podcast or the topics covered in it, or if you want to get a pin on our map, do please send us an email. The address globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk. Some people who have done just that: Prem Kumar Rajendran, originally from India, now in Germany; Nikki in Amsterdam, listening with her splendid cat, Mr. Hinkle; Reese in the UAE, listening with well-informed dogs Ella and Efron; and Anna with Cashew in Prague. Yes, animals will get you noticed, and look out for the hashtag Global News Pets. You will also find us, of course, on Twitter @Global News Pod. This edition was mixed by Mike Adley. The producer was Shirley Gordon. Our editor is Karen Martin. I'm Jackie Leonard. Until next time, goodbye.